Avatar: The Last Airbender, Imbalance, Issue 2. It starts with Aang reuniting with his friends, and a page later explaining that the guy he captured was so grateful he told him he was hired by 2 teenage girls. But he didn't know exactly who it was that hired him or why, so there's no point in him being given information. The hero should have been able to figure out it was sabotage on their own. Aang tells Toph's dad to tell him the names of the other sabotage factories so he can investigate for a connection, and he gets thanked. They shouldn't need to investigate though. This is the most obvious mystery ever. Eventually, somehow Aang doesn't notice a connection between the factories, and Sokka's the only one to notice that they're all owned by non-benders. You'd think every factory with job-stealing machines would have been hit, not just these ones, so they'd still be a threat. Somehow he has to explain why this happened. I hate that he has to spend almost 2 pages explaining the obvious to him. Aang plans on asking the benders who own businesses to help the damaged businesses of non-benders. Of course, it only worked for some of them, but I can see why he'd want to try just in case. I like that Toph isn't impressed by the mansion while Sokka is because of their backgrounds. Katara is smart enough to doubt Lilling would humor him because not only are the other factories owned by non-benders, but they're competitors. Which is why he shouldn't have bothered with her, let alone had her as the first choice. Aang thanks her as she sucks up to him just to avoid suspicion, which I guess is why she's wasting time getting him to talk about the fact that this place has changed. Why did Momo do that? Of course it annoyed the cat. Sokka again asks why she's saying humble when it's not true, but it's easy to believe that she knows that and it's just a figure of speech she's using because other people do. It's really boring to see this scene. It's no wonder the artist started showing Momo chase a cat. It may be completely irrelevant, but at least it's slightly more interesting to see than a billion panels of talking heads. This is an admirable thing for an artist to do, which I was first told about by Sonic Dissected. Don't just draw characters talking, draw other things too so you won't get too bored. This is something Sonic comics, every comic should do. But since I don't really care about Momo, it's still not enough to make up for the boring tone of the scene full of calm talking. This scene is mandatory to progress the plot, but they should have just had a heavily edited down version of the conversation. Predictably, something in the house gets damaged, and Aang offers to fix it with earthbending. Why did she tell Yelling to bring her sister here too? Just so she can watch and envy while she fixes it? Yelling could have poured water on it herself. So this means Rue's really desperate to feel useful. Toph insists on showing off her metal bending to her. It's too bad it's not explained what Rue's other talents are. You'd think Rue would tell them what they are if the comic wants us to believe she's insecure. It's sweet that Yelling's not being rude out of jealousy. All she does is say she's being amazing. Toph acts like she's planning to tell her what else is cool and asks her if she's ever been up a certain cliff when clearly there's nothing else that's cool for her to say. Sadly, the story cuts ahead instead of showing me what in the world she said after that, when there'd be nothing, so she just wondered why she asked her that. Lilling thanks Aang and stupidly turns down a potential reward. Then Toph's approached by Yelling because she wants to learn metal bending, and she acts as respectful as possible. Then the 2 sisters have an argument about Yelling's idea at full volume close to Toph, who would be able to feel their exact conversation if she can feel everything around her all the time because she'd have learned from experience how every sound feels. So even if she didn't have better hearing than other people because of the stereotype that blind people have better hearing, she'd still essentially, functionally have better hearing. Somehow Rue doesn't think it's a good idea for her to become more competent. As soon as Aang leaves the house, Toph tells them Lilling's involved in the sabotage somehow. She recognized her daughters because she felt them running away from the factory when it exploded. And somehow Katara thinks that's thin evidence, even though her daughters would have had no excuse for being near the factory. Toph says that Yelling lied about being near the cliff, so she figured out what she did. Eventually, Toph says she'll only pretend to teach Yelling metal bending, and find out what she and her mom are up to while she's failing at it. So she's smarter than I thought. I guess by pretend she means that she won't teach her to focus on the impurities within the metal. She doesn't even have to just pretend. It takes too long to teach people metal bending anyways, so one lesson wouldn't teach her that. Apparently. Eventually, Suki shows up and shares a hug with Sokka. I wonder why she's wearing red when she's not Fire Nation. I like it, but it's confusing for this part of the series. She says that she got here riding a green animal. Why does Satoru think it'll take months to repair his machine? He should have known Toph would be able to fix it. She fixed an engine in front of him before. Satoru fortunately reiterates that he feels guilty about causing this whole mess. Why does she think he knows it's not true that he made people obsolete? She says even if he hadn't made those machines, there'd still be some jobless benders. It doesn't change the fact that he still put people out of a job so he can make more money. And he still caused the whole plot. Toph sits there and lets Yelling try to metal bend with no direction about how to do it, and pretends to be her friend by talking about Aang negatively with her, and lying that she'd be fine with the machines not getting fixed right away. She's asked if Aang and her are close, and the other panel with no dialogue reveals that she's lying when she says no. She's trying to get her to underestimate Aang. If something could happen, that'd be great. Like The Promise, this is just a novel with more pictures sometimes. I guess the reason she thought she wasn't lying despite her not talking in a panel is that she was really desperate to believe her. She expects me to believe that only since the end of the 100-Year War have things gone out of balance between benders and non-benders. Even though this is a conflict as old as bending, the Fire Nation was capturing earthbenders and waterbenders, making them rare in public, ever since the start of the 100-Year War. But now they've all been freed, so the balance is restored. I mean, it's out of balance for the waterbenders, but other than that, why would she say since the end instead of since the start? She tells Toph there's a meeting tonight for concerned citizens and gives her the password off screen. I don't know why that'd be off screen, but I'm all for faster pacing. It's just, you shouldn't cut out stuff that's actually important. It's just weird what it chooses not to show. So Toph tells her friends to go with her there. She plans on finding people to force them to tell her what's going on, clearly not knowing that forced confessions can be fake just to get the torture to stop. And she became a chief of police later. I guess she matured when she grew up. Sokka makes another plan that doesn't involve violence, and instead has them going to the meeting in disguises for the most part to just gather information, meaning more talking. I'm glad Aang wears a wig instead of a hat because that hides his identity better. I guess he couldn't find a wig store the last time he was disguised. Eventually Sokka flatters Suki and she thanks him and does the same to him. Eventually the password gets spoken and the heroes realize they were heading for the old mine that was supposed to be filled in. It's too bad Aang isn't written to whisper when talking about people he recognizes, because I'm forced to assume he is, or else they should recognize his voice. They should know it's him talking because he's talking about the fact that he recognizes him. Then the story gets boring again when Lily makes a predictable speech that she's mad at Toph's father for implying that he wants benders replaced with machines. She says benders are worth more than non-benders, which makes Rue look unhappy. Why is she up here next to her then? So far this is the only part of this that gives us new information. It's not like there's something wrong with her being written to do a speech. The point of this is to establish that she's rallying more bender violence. But why wasn't the speech condensed by a lot? I'm distracted the whole time by more boredom because I already know all of this. Why aren't the heroes written to be whispering? The comic already established how it shows people whispering. It has smaller text. And yet I have to pretend they're whispering for it to make sense that their dialogue doesn't give them away to the people around them. Lilling has a plan to drive the non-benders away without attracting the attention of the Earth King army. And we already know that plan, because she's already been carrying it out. She says her town will become a city that only belongs to benders, and nobody's reminding her that Rue isn't a bender. So I have to assume that some people don't know that, and the ones that do are just being polite to her, and assume that she thinks of Rue as the exception. And Rue does as well. I guess she plans to have a policy in place that exiles any new non-benders from the town other than her daughter, because otherwise the town won't stay full bender. Her plan is doomed from the start. Plenty of people would keep their babies with them regardless of whether they turned out to be benders, because they'd be too emotionally attached to them. I don't know why Toph went up on stage and threatened to arrest Lily and started a fight. I get that she's a hothead, but there's no point. It's just her word against the councilwoman. Nobody's gonna believe her, so she won't be able to arrest her. A fight starts, and Aang spreads dust, drawing attention to who he is. The speech against him wasn't necessary because these people would have turned on him the second he showed that he was against them anyways. We already knew that she was manipulative and smart. Nothing but predictable, uncreative stuff happens after this. It's cool to see, especially towards the end of Toph's fight. It's just that there's nothing to say about this, and none of it matters. It's smart of Toph to try to make Yelling think she can't metal bend because she's bad at bending when she's clearly not, to discourage her from getting more dangerous to her. It's satisfying to see that because she's one of the bad guys. Yelling gets a rough landing, getting her sister worried, and have to assume that she's just lying about the boomerang not being dangerous despite Sokka, because she should know it can hurt. Sokka asks Rue how she could be okay with her mother's plan. Eventually, Yelling's chi blocked, and at some point Lillian uses magic to make a way to escape for her supporters while she holds them off. She bluntly tells Yelling that when she's chi blocked, she's next to useless, so she should know better than to offer to fight. Eventually, Lillian's told she's under arrest, and somehow Yelling wonders if her bending won't come back and just has to say that then she'll be like her. Isn't it obvious she shouldn't say that? She knew to tell Sokka to shut up because he was reminding her she's a non-bender, and then she says this. We end up seeing Lillian in a metal cage, and the heroes talk for 1,000,000 years, with one pointing out that the whole conflict won't be resolved by just keeping her locked up. Toph tells Aang to take her bending away so that her supporters would back off, even though that'd only make a martyr out of her, and wouldn't force them to back off. I have to assume that this makes sense because she's desperate and this is the only idea that came to her. She's too impatient to think things through all the way. The story ends there. Avatar: The Last Airbender, Imbalance Issue 3. The first page is wasted, and Toph somehow thinks it'll fix everything if Lillian loses her bending, even though clearly someone else could be chosen as a replacement anyways. Eventually, Katara says that taking away someone's bending isn't to be taken lightly because it's removing a part of who they are. And Sokka says if Aang did this to a civilian, he'd make benders mad at him. It should be Aang saying all of this. He's the main character and the one who even can debend people. So the point of this scene was supposed to be establishing why he doesn't debend all of his enemies because he did it to Ozai. So for a scene like this, it should be him saying it to make excuses for himself. He somehow thinks he could talk Lillian out of this, and doesn't immediately just say that he's opposed to debending. That implies that it's more like it's that his friends pressure him to not doing this to keep their approval, not that he's against it. Lillian tells Aang he should have killed Ozai because she's dumb enough to think a life without bending isn't worth it, even though there's other fun stuff to do. What's the point of us seeing a villain scene? I already knew that Rue would end up having second thoughts about this from earlier issues, so there really is no point to showing them scheming, because I already knew they planned on rescuing their mom. I don't need to see another scene of Katara telling Aang that debending sounds wrong to her. She makes her point better by saying that it sounds violent because she's comparing it to losing a limb. It's not literally like that. And she could have said this in the first scene. Satoru warns them that the council is under attack and some of the counselors are trapped in a burning building. So the fire starts getting put out by the heroes, and Toph breaks into the building. So her father gets complimented because of her, and he looks proud of her. He still barely interacts with her in this arc though. Of course, Yelling rushes ahead with some benders, and the non-bender heroes get trapped in the earth. Yelling does the same to the guard to steal his keys. Go figure, she effortlessly gets past the non-benders and unlocks the cage. And we get to see her and her mother share a hug. One of the injured counselors is scared because Lillian escaped, showing that at least one person took the heroes' word for it on her. Katara wants to heal someone who wants his officers taught how to chi block. The idea gets brought up to Sokka, so he praises Suki. Rue expected her mother to have the good sense to flee the city on a ship with them, and she's too stubborn and arrogant to do it, even though she already lost to the Avatar. Which is further justified because she already had to leave a city once. Eventually it's revealed that she thinks the reason Ba Sing Se fell was because the Earth King was a non-bender, even though he still would have been outnumbered and defeated anyways. So this is a flimsy excuse that wasn't even necessary to explain her. Tai Li was among the fake Kyoshi warriors, so she would have just Chi-blocked the Earth King. It's only logical that some benders would think this way. At least she stands up to her. She says Ozai was only doing what any strong bender leader would do by taking advantage of a weakness. Even though again, bending wouldn't have prevented the coup, and Azula would have tried to overthrow him either way. She asks her mom if she sees her as weak, as if she somehow didn't already know that. Why would this be news to her? She doesn't deny it, because it's true. She's not strong in any sort of way. She's not athletic, for one thing. I thought Rue would be offended because of her sympathizing with the last Fire Lord, because that'd make her see her as just like him. I guess she was, but her acting like her problem was that she felt insecure just makes me wonder why it took her so long to turn on her. She could have been against her whole plan from the start and not admitted it, and the arc would have been the same because there'd really be nothing she could have done. And it could make sense if she'd be too scared to tell Aang on her. It was really for the best that she stayed with her until this point, because this way she finds out her plan. There was really no reason for her to tell a non-bender about her plan, regardless of whether it was her daughter though. It turns out Suki's already taught some guards the basics of chi blocking. And Aang wonders if Toph was completely right when he shouldn't need to be told that the supremacist movement is more than one person. Of course he's not willing to debend her followers too. In any other franchise, the concept of debending wouldn't be controversial like this. In the Sabrina sitcom, the Witches' Council was perfectly fine with getting rid of Salem's powers by turning him into a cat. Although since earthbending can be used for non-violent things, Katara had a point because it would be sad if some debended person wanted to do a non-violent thing with bending, like make sculptures, but couldn't after she stopped being violent. Aang says the Fire Nation only went to war because it had technology, and demonizes the machines entirely. Sokka has to talk him out of it, saying that machines are good for non-benders. Aang apologizes, and Sokka reminds him that the Fire Nation war would have started anyways because Sozin was a jerk. He shouldn't have needed to tell him that. Eventually, Sokka sees Rue, who's too shy to talk to him at first. And predictably, she says she's not okay with her family's plan. Sokka compares her to Zuko. So a page later, for some reason, she finally tells him her mother's planning to attack Earth and Fire Industries in the morning with an army. Then she asks Suki to teach her to chi block. The next morning, Aang sees some people go up to him with supplies for the non-benders and their benders themselves. But when Aang asks them to protect their neighbors, they cowered out. Which is smart of them at least. They are outnumbered. Liling once again doesn't clarify that she still wants Rue around in her ideal town. So I still don't know if she meant it when she said she loved her. I wish it was written to Earthbend right away. They already had this exact same talk. You'd think the heroes would point out that if she got her ideal town, she'd have to give up her daughter. Or people would expect her to. The actual show was mostly episodic, so there's no excuse for the comics never having the talent to tell a story and wrap it up in one plot. Aang makes a maze for the army, and eventually the wolves get moved by Toph, who reveals chi blockers. And let's just assume that it makes sense that all of them can do that successfully with the amount of training they have. And the basics are all they need for this exact situation. After all, they did catch them by surprise in a dead end. So the benders didn't have any time to do anything in a panic. Then some of the benders get frozen. This is all entertaining. I love the variety. Toph says this is fun, gets knocked to the ground by yawling, and the typical stuff happens between them all over again. Sokka gets faced with an army and gets asked to defeat a chi blocker. He smartly boasts that he is, Although it's not smart of him to boast a bit too much and run the risk of people assuming he's lying and trying too hard to convince them. And this makes me wonder why in the world he hasn't learned how to chi block by now. There's no reason for him not to join in on the lessons. I know the meta reason is that Suki being able to chi block is what makes her special, and Ty Lee's not here to do that anymore, so that's the only reason they think it's okay for her to give up what makes her special as a main character. But considering that it could get into a fight again any given day still, it's just dumb of him to not learn just to keep Suki from feeling like she's not as useful. Because I doubt Suki's that insecure. And most of the time he's not around Suki. Sokka throws a boomerang at him and says he can chi block from a distance. And the army runs towards him, which disappoints him. He should have known not to do this. After all, they didn't seem interested in fighting anymore, despite him only being one guy. So he should have waited until one of them showed hostility again. Eventually, it only gets interesting again when a hole is made in the roof and Toph grabs a rope while Yawling falls into sand. She traps the people behind her, and Lilling wonders how the heroes were already prepared for her. I guess the reason it makes sense that Rue fesses up is that she thinks she'll get figured out anyways, because she's the only reason they would already be prepared. And she gets angry when calling her out, so she also wanted an excuse to do that. She says that she helped Lilling out because she was told her plan was supposed to protect Benders, but the non-Benders aren't a threat. She tells her that she only did her plan for herself, and there's no proof that she's right. She tries to chi block her, but her mother thinks to dodge. Maybe if she tried to chi block her when she was talking, it would have worked. Because Ty Lee succeeded in this with Azula. She probably assumed she'd attack her because punches always telegraph themselves. But if that was the excuse, Azula would have dodged Ty Lee's attack because attacks telegraph themselves. She plans to bury her rather than just going away from her. So Aang plans to save her. Meanwhile, Toph gets knocked on the floor and says that it'd be stupid of her to think she's better than someone purely because he's a non-bender. And naturally, since benders can do everything non-benders can do, and then some, she's completely confused by her calling this stupid, which gives Sokka the time to hit her head with a boomerang to knock her out. Benders don't learn boomerangs because they don't need to because they have bending, so this was the only way to make a non-bender look special. Also, why is she knocked out by a boomerang to the head when Azula wasn't in the search? Toph thanks him, and eventually Aang saves Rue, and freezes her mother in place. Katara goes up to him because she happened to be nearby, which I guess makes sense because she's his girlfriend. She tells him that he should debend her for the right reason, not because it seems like an easy solution or because he's mad. This changes his mind. We get to see Rue call her out, even if she does agree that she's ungrateful. Instead of pointing out that she is still grateful she raised her until everything went wrong. Because it's better her mother raised her than someone else, because her mother still hugged her and was still related to her. And there probably isn't a good foster care system at this point in time. And God forbid her mother get ridden to regret going too far with her, instead of being a one-dimensional cartoon villain everything but motive, who is lying about loving her. It's no wonder I forgot her. One of the only things distinct about this arc is the situation of a non-bender turning on her villain parent for a supremacist attitude. It's too bad it wasn't confirmed that Zuko's daughter in The Legend of Korra was a non-bender. I always assumed she was, but it should have been established to make Zuko look all the better. It'd be a nice contrast. Later, Toph's dad thanks Suki, who plans to stay in the town with the Kyoshi warriors to continue training the non-bender police. Somebody should point out that Zuko can handle himself. He's always been able to win against assassins. Even then, it's still risking his life. Rue complains that she should be in the cage with her family, even though she didn't break the law, and nobody says this. And when she tells Suki she could have stood up to them sooner, somehow Suki doesn't tell her that it'd be a bad idea because then her mother wouldn't have trusted her enough to tell her latest plan. At least she has a blanket. But it gets needlessly depressing when you remember that she said these were the only family she has. At this age. It should be explained that she plans on becoming a G-blocking cop. At least then we'd have some direction for what her future is gonna be, and we could assume that she does have loved ones later on because she became friends with the other cops. Instead, it comes off like she's gonna be alone the rest of her life. Sokka reassures Aang. 3 days later, Aang explains that he knew that debending Lilin wouldn't fix anything because it was the bigotry that was her problem. Even though Rue had a point that if she became a non-bender, that's the only way she'd be able to find out that non-benders can have great lives and be useful too. But the fact that Aang even considered debending her is trying to imply that Katara stopped him from going down the slippery slope and hurting his reputation, which completely demonizes the entire idea of removing an evil person's magical powers. When in any other franchise, most people would think it's a reasonable solution. Aang says he wants to stay in this town for now because he feels a connection to this place. Just because the writer says so, even though it's a place where even benders and non-benders hate each other, so it's the worst town he's ever been in. And he's been completely unsuccessful at alleviating that problem. Sokka's argument that he bridged the divide by becoming his friend ignores the fact that they became friends because of Aang's personality, and getting people to like him in particular is not the same thing as getting them to stop being just jealous and scared of benders they don't like and trust. Instead, all he can do is get them to see him as the exception. I expect them to want to live in you down. The story agrees with Aang agreeing with Sokka that the city needs a better name, but we don't learn what the name is anyways, so it should have ended earlier. The reason this joke keeps happening is that this place is supposed to be a precursor to the Republic City. I don't think it was clear enough. Just because there's conflict between benders and non-benders doesn't mean it makes sense that this place is Republic City, because this kind of conflict could be in any town. I thought it was going to be down. These comics really needed better pacing. I constantly get taken out of the story by recognizing that it's getting boring, wasting my time. This issue by Faith Hicks is about the heroes infiltrating an anti-non-bender rally where Lillian provokes them into turning on her, and eventually trapping her. It was really boring because it was 99% talking, and a lot of that is just reiterating what I already know, so it's not like most of it is interesting. I get it, there's tensions between benders and non-benders. That doesn't mean you should talk my ear off about it. We're not so stupid that we won't understand the situation after the first panel is mentioned. Constantly telling us about this hatred isn't going to make the story any more interesting. Using it does, like having a machine get destroyed by it. But seeing a rally where a boring speech happens isn't interesting. It's just another instance of characters standing around and talking. And eventually there's bending violence like in the beginning of the arc. So of course it's a forgettable story. It's not like it wasn't cool to see the bending, but none of it was plot relevant or super interesting. I suppose Toph's confrontation with Yalin was the highlight. It also establishes that Rue is looked down on by her mother, just in case there was anyone in the audience assuming that her mother was making her think she didn't look down on her. This issue by Faith Hicks is about the army trying to destroy a factory getting stopped by Toph, who entertainingly traps them in a maze where they have to deal with a variety of things. And Aang freezes Lilin, which she could have done right away before she tried to kill Rue, something that didn't need to be written. She felt more like a complex, believable character when she was telling her she loved her. There's nothing wrong with that not being a lie. A villain can have loved ones too, especially one with a motive as understandable as hers where it's not just black and white. Even non-villains can get mad at a machine for taking people's jobs. So she was only a villain by wanting non-benders taken out of the city just for not liking her, when they would only not like her if they knew she was a bender. She was still nice to her for the whole arc on the surface, so it seems like she only tried to kill her because it's an action series and it's supposed to make a big impression, and it's signaling to you that now you're supposed to think she's really evil. Which makes me wonder why the writer wrote her to hug her kids so much then, when I never saw a villain do that before. So this just dumbs her down by going with a more predictable option, when she could have simply taken off from her. The only thing interesting about her was the idea that she seems to be a loving mother. So if you reveal that that was only an act, she's just Ozai, and a reverse Unalaq. Maybe her not trying to kill Rue like she's not even her mother, like it's Ozai trying to lightning band Zuko again, and instead trying to get away from her, refusing to hurt her, and apologizing to her after she's frozen, would have had me remember her, because no villain in the series shows a genuine reluctance to hurt her kid, and a willingness to forgive her, which would have given her an identity, bringing her character right back around to one of her first scenes to say that at the end of the day, she's still a parent. It's her kid, so it would have been believable. Not every villain would do that. Parents are incredibly forgiving of their kids sometimes. This was the good issue in the arc. But it was still mostly boring talking. Lilling should have known not to tell her non-bender kid about her plan against non-benders. There's literally no reason for her to tell her to work with Yaling because she was completely useless to Yaling.